Hi everyone, my name is Gia. I'm a second year student at the University of Toronto, and this is MD Consultants Facebook live session where we'll be answering a whole bunch of questions regarding Canadian med school interviews, and I'll be answering a whole bunch of questions compiled from a bunch of curious students, and this will be based on my experiences going through the interview process and also my experiences as a med student at the University of Toronto. So if you have any questions for me during the course of the session, feel free to type them in the comment box below, and I'll be trying to get through them as many as possible before our session ends at 8:30. So just a little background about me. I did my undergrad at Queen's University, and after 3 years, I applied to medical school, and thankfully I was able to get in my first try. So this sort of addresses the first question, which was where I applied to and where I got offers from. I applied to 4 schools in Ontario: Ottawa, Toronto, Queen's, and McMaster, and I got interviews from McMaster, Ottawa, and the University of Toronto, and I was waitlisted at Ottawa, and I got offers from Mac and the University of Toronto, which is where I am now. I didn't apply to Western because they don't take students out of third year, which is when I was applying. So the second question is, what was your biggest fear about interviews and how did I overcome that? So I think my biggest fear was being prepared and actually knowing what to say and not getting stuck while also seeming authentic. And I think how I overcame that was I tried to do a lot of readings to prepare myself for the sort of ethics questions or scenario-based questions that I could get. And that helped me have a lot of ideas about, how the healthcare system functions, about some policy, about some legal issues perhaps, and about current topics in medicine at the time. And that really helped me that helped give me the content that I needed that I would need to talk about at a particular MMI station or at a panel or an MPI. And basically by not memorizing answers to a whole bunch of possible scenario questions or practice questions, you avoid sounding over-rehearsed or robotic almost. So that's how I was able to overcome that fear. The third question I have here is there an advantage/disadvantage to interviewing earlier, later in the day with interviewers comparing you to previous applicants? So I don't think there's an advantage or a disadvantage to interviewing either earlier or later in the day in terms of the interviewers comparing you to previous candidates. They sort of have a marking scheme in front of them, and that marking scheme differs based on what school you're interviewing at, and they're sort of kind of true to the marking scheme and try and just mark you according to your performance in that moment. I don't think that they're comparing you necessarily with the last person that they saw, because really for interview questions there is no right or wrong answer. It's really more a matter of opinion and how you make yourself stand out as a unique candidate or someone who's just really suitable for the role of medicine. And that is really conveyed through your personal experiences, and people tend to actually discount how much your nonverbal communication matters. So the way you introduce yourself, perhaps telling them that it's a pleasure to meet the interviewer, your body language, whether you seem interested, enthusiastic and passionate about being there, and they can really tell whether you're genuine or not. So I think those things actually matter more, and they're not necessarily comparing you to different candidates depending on whether it's earlier or later in the day. I think you are basically judged for your performance in that moment. The only advantage or disadvantage to interviewing earlier or later in the day is whether you're a morning person or whether you're an afternoon person. I didn't like the morning interviews because you tended to have to get up pretty early, and they started usually 7:30 or 8, and because you want to be ready and you want to be alert, you tend to wake up quite early in the morning, and that wasn't my thing. So personally, I really liked afternoon interviews, and I felt more relaxed and alert for those, but it really depends on whether like you're a morning person or whether you're an afternoon person. I think that's about the only advantage or disadvantage to interviewing either later or earlier in the day. Another question I have here is, with argument scenarios, are you supposed to hold your prompted opinion the entire scenario? Is it wrong to see your opponent's point of view as they would have won their argument? So this really depends on the question and sort of the style of interviewing the style of interview that you're performing or that you're giving. So a lot of scenario-based questions, basically they're not really testing whether you're going to give them like the right answer or you know, what's the most ethically sound answer. They're really testing your critical thinking skills and your communication skills. So do you see and are you able to articulate that there are multiple facets in this scenario or in this problem that that should be considered? So say you have an issue about, let's say, you know, what are the benefits of passing medical marijuana? So, or, you know, what is or like, you know, discuss the implications of having, you know, medical marijuana be legalized in Canada. So say that's your question. You want to be able to convey and articulate to the interviewer that you can understand both the pros and the cons of doing so, or what the risk benefit are. So it's more about seeing both aspects and being able to discuss those. Now, if the prompt on the door, say you're in an MMI scenario and the prompt at the door says that they want you to pick a side, or like, you know, make a decision at the end of whatever scenario you're given, then you are responsible for doing that. So then, and in those cases, I would, you know, state my assumptions. So if you have incomplete information in the scenario, which is often the case in terms of MMI, because they like to keep the questions open-ended, then state your assumptions or state any information that you would want that holds true in order for your answer to make sense. So like, you know, assuming X, Y, and Z, I would make this decision. So if you include that information, then I think it's completely fine to state your opinion. And sometimes these scenarios just ask you to discuss the implications of a scenario or of a problem. They don't necessarily tell you to choose a side. So in that case, just discuss both the pros and the cons, and then give a summary statement at the end of whatever you've discussed. And so going back to the question that was initially asked, it's not wrong to see your opponent's point of view or the other point of view. You don't necessarily have to stick to your opinion the entire scenario. I think as long as you show that you've considered, you know, both risks and benefits, or, you know, have done an analysis of the pros and cons, I don't think it's wrong to choose the other option, or you're not obligated to stick to your opinion the whole time. So the fifth question is, how can you avoid tiptoeing around an MMI scenario if it is a discussion-based question? So quite frankly, I don't think you can avoid tiptoeing around an MMI scenario, because quite frankly, it's you get points for answering the question. And I think that's really the first thing that they're looking for. Like, did you directly answer the question? Because I think if you misinterpret the question, or whether you're tiptoeing around the issue, they're going to see that as not actually addressing the prompt or the scenario. And I don't imagine that you would do very well or score very well at that station. So some tips too, however, like tiptoe, although I wouldn't necessarily call it that, is to speak in hypotheticals. So if you don't know a lot about a certain issue, whether it's like, you know, Indigenous health, or whether it's passing, you know, new policy for, you know, a new admissions process, say that's your question. If you don't know much about the policies or the legal aspects, or you're just not sure of the issue, or you don't have much of a background, then I would just speak in hypotheticals and it's completely okay to say, I don't know much about this, but assuming that this is the case, and then you can make whatever assumptions or speak in whatever hypotheticals, and that's how you would approach that question. Because you still need to make a direct attempt to answer what they're asking you. But if you don't know, or you're not well versed in that topic, it's completely okay to say that you're not 100% in this topic, or this is not something you know much about, and to proceed just based on making, certain assumptions or speaking in hypotheticals. But I don't encourage that anyone tiptoe around an MMI scenario or any interview question for that matter, because you do need to directly answer the question in order to sort of get good points at that scenario or that station. So another question that we have is, how can you avoid interview fatigue? So I think the best way to avoid interview fatigue is obviously to sleep well the night before, to hydrate, a little bit of coffee if that's something that you do like to, drink, maybe coffee or tea. But I wouldn't suggest overdoing that, because you might get maybe tremors or maybe a bit shaky. So avoid over caffeinating, and it's good to definitely hydrate, go to the bathroom way before it's time for you to interview, and just sleeping well and eating well. I think that eating foods with sort of like a high glycemic index that will sort of carry you throughout a whole morning or a whole afternoon without having like a sugar crash or would be best. And they always feed you at interviews too. So even if you don't feel hungry necessarily, because you'll probably be thinking about the interview and you'll probably be nervous, just eat something anyway. I think because you'll be occupied with an interview, you won't really feel hungry, but it's best to just eat anything anyway and just maybe take a couple sips of water. And then as for the stamina that you need, especially for, MMIs, really you need to practice. I would suggest doing circuits, whether for at least an hour straight, just practice scenarios over and over again. And by simulating the real circuit as much as possible, that's how you'll be able to, get yourself to that level of stamina that's required for an MMI situation. Now, MMIs, they do have break stations as well. So I think they have 12 stations total, out of which 2 will be break stations. And I suggest that you strategically stand at a station door so that your break stations are like in between. So like I, for example, stood at like the 4th door before a rest. So I did 4 stations, then I did a rest, and then I did like a whole bunch more stations, and then I did a rest. That way my rests were spread out. I don't recommend starting or ending at a break, because at a break station, because that doesn't really serve you well for MMI purposes. So if you can choose to stand at a door, that's 5 or 4 away from a break station, then that might be a good way. But practice is the only way to really avoid interview fatigue and to have that stamina for the real day. Another question that we have here is, what style of interview do you find is the easiest to prepare for, MMI, panel, or MPI? So I personally liked MPI best. I think it's the interview style where you're most at ease, just because there's one person in front of you and they do interact with you extensively, whereas at an MMI situation, they don't necessarily interact with you, and they don't like smile or give you like positive. I wonder what's happening. Sorry about that. Hello? Sorry about that. At MMIs, they don't really give you like feedback or like a smile or any like positive cues. So I found that a bit intimidating, because you're not really getting any like nonverbal feedback from anyone else. And then MMIs is also just, it's super long. So because you have like 12 stations, of course, 2 of them will be rest stations, but it is a long process. Whereas MPIs is 4 stations, even though they're about 12 minutes long. It's more relaxing because you're not constantly, coming into a room, going out, coming in, going out. That can fatigue you more. And then panel, I don't enjoy panel. Just, again, there's 3 people in front of you who are all sort of looking at you, and there's a lot of pressure on you, or so it feels. And it's less of an informal setting. And panel, you have to be prepared to talk about yourself at length and really have your personal questions prepared. And I find panel, especially at Ottawa, you get a lot of questions that are very tough to answer, like, tell me about yourself. So those are really hard because, like, what do I tell you about myself, right? So if you have panel, I definitely suggest to prepare for 2 questions. The first one being, tell me about yourself. So try and include something meaningful that's not related to medicine, that sort of shows who you are outside of like your work and your career aspirations. And then the second question being, why medicine? So make sure you have a really, really good story or a couple of reasons outlining why medicine and why not any other healthcare profession, or why not other professions that also help people. So make sure you have the answer to those questions down really well. And I think because there's a lot more they could throw at you in terms of like variability, it's really hard to it's really hard to prepare yourself for a panel. And because you're sitting in one place, you can't help but feel judged for your performance on the last question. So I remember feeling that I didn't do so well on one question, and then for that sort of feeling that I had sort of, not done that well, carried over to the next question and the next question, because you're sitting in the same room the whole time. So I found panel a bit tough because of that. So my favorite is definitely MPI. Fewer stations, more informal, and you do get to interact with the interviewer more and ask them questions even. So MPI was definitely my favorite, and it's also one where you can be yourself most, or so I find. So another question that we have here is, how can you sell yourself in the MMI answering the scenario prompts? So if you're asked a scenario-based question or an ethics-based question, the first thing you have to do is answer the question. And then if you have any relevant personal experiences or extracurriculars or events in your life that sort of line up with that scenario or that relate, then you want to maybe talk about those for 1 or 2 minutes, and then you want to again transition back to talking about the question or scenario, and then wrapping up with a conclusion statement. So say it's a question about conflict management. So say they're saying that your scenario in this station is that you're having a conflict with someone, in your group, and your assignment is due in 2 days. What do you do? So say that's your prompt. Then you can answer your question. So I would approach the situation like this, and then answer that, and then you could move to saying something like, in my experience working with a team doing this activity, this is what happened and this is what I learned. And then you can sort of connect that back to the question and transition back to the answering the question and wrapping it up. So that's how you sell yourself in the scenario prompts. And that's really just through, integrating your personal examples and talking about yourself, by framing your experiences and your life events within the CanMeds role. So whenever you can, talk about yourself as a communicator, collaborator, scholar, health advocate, all of those CanMeds roles, do it. And then, of course, for personal questions, you'll be talking about yourself more at length. But in scenario prompts, you definitely want to talk about your personal experience or your events in your life whenever you can, whether it's for 1 or 2 minutes. But make sure you've answered the question directly first, because that's really important, and that's really what you get points for. Another question that we have is, how can you show your upbeat and positive personality if you have a scenario with a serious topic? So I would say that your upbeat and positive personality come through when you walk through the room and you introduce yourself and the way you carry yourself. And this goes back to something I was mentioning before about the nonverbal communication in an interview being very important. And I think it's normal when you're talking about like maybe a serious topic or a sad a sad event in your life or something that was challenging or frustrating, for your tone and for your facial expressions to naturally match that. And that's good. That's normal. I think it would be really, really weird and probably would come off badly if you were talking about, medically assisted dying with like a big smile on your face, or if you were talking about, a time that was super challenging in your life with a big smile on your face. Maybe if you're, talking about the resolution of those events, sure, but you want to make sure that your tone and your facial expressions match up with what you're talking about. And then when you wrap up, you can always, end with a smile or, and of course your introduction, the way when you come to the room and, tell them your name, that's really important to sort of show your upbeat and positive personality. And the last question we have here for today is, how long after the interview should you expect notice of acceptance or rejection? So all acceptances or rejections happen on the same day. I believe that's May 1st or May 2nd this year. I'm not really sure, but it's all on the same day. So regardless of when you interview, you'll all hear back on the same day, unless you're interviewing out of province. But if you've applied to just schools in Ontario, then they should all get back to you on the same day. So thanks for joining our session today. If you have additional questions for me or about the medical school interview process in general, feel free to email info@mdconsultants.ca or send us a message over on Facebook. And if you have any questions, particularly about, optimizing your chances of obtaining an interview or about, your interview performance, we have multiple courses and resources available, including interview preparation videos on the MD Consultants website and an admissions guarantee package. And the link will be included in the comment section below. If you like today's session and would like to hear from medical trainees and physicians here, like us here at MD Consultants, please let us know, and we'd be happy to have another Facebook Live, or you could contact us through our website. Thank you. Have a good night.